Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. I'm very glad to be joined this week again by Ross Ramsey, executive editor of the Texas Tribune. Welcome, Ross. How are you doing?
How are you, sir?
I'm well. It's kind of nice to. I've been saying this the last few weeks, and it's. I should be settled in now, but I'm still really happy to be back in the studio rather than online and with our great crew here and back on campus. So
it's nice to be back in the world of 3D.
Exactly. I appreciate you being here, knowing that you are preparing to move, among other things, move houses, I should say.
Yeah.
But I wanted to check in on the range of issues that you focused on in, as I count them, your last four columns over the last week, which is, I guess it technically 8 days given the rhythm of publication. But just to run down the topics you've done, you talked about public ed and an analysis of kind of the issue terrain and what Texas leaders seem to be paying attention to right now. You wrote about broadband and the ongoing conversation and the pace of the efforts to bring high-speed internet to areas of the state without it. You wrote about abortion, and then this morning you wrote a piece on redistricting, talking about the implications of gerrymandering. I want to set the abortion column aside for just a moment. I mean, many would argue that it fits just perfectly in this, and I think it does, but as I look at the columns on public ed, on broadband, on redistricting, I see you focusing on, the fundamentals of the state's infrastructure. And again, I don't want to sell abortion short as part of the state's health infrastructure, but it is a little bit different than the structural nature of these other issues. Now, am I imagining things? Is this just the random play of searching for column topics that are current, or are you mulling the fundamentals here?
Well, this is part of a bigger sort of series of columns I've been writing. I'm retiring at the end of the month, and I thought, we sat down with an editor here, Ian Mitra, who you know, and talked about, what do we want to do with the last columns, and decided to sort of take on a long series of columns on if you were going to go at government and sort of move the big pieces first and stop moving the little pieces, what would you move around? And the part that you've sort of isolated here is a section on infrastructure. And, it's like I say, it's part of the series that, includes a lot of the big things government does. But this last series, or these most recent columns, with the exception of abortion, are really about infrastructure. And the idea here is really, if you set you can't really do this, but if you set politics aside, what would government be working on? And by the way, how are they doing it? And that's sort of the general idea. And then you go topic by topic and say, well, what about broadband and how are we doing there? And what's going on over here with school finance and schools and education in general? And what, if the legislature was only doing one or two or three things, what would they be and how are they doing with them? Sort of the general thing.
All right. Well, I want to unpack a few of those things, and it's funny you say, how can we talk about this separate from politics? And I think in each of these columns, it's almost as if it's almost impossible to do that to some degree. Impossible is a strong word. But it's a matter, I guess, of pride of place. So start with education, and so tell me, as you looked and you picked education as part of this. Tell me what you saw.
Well, you see two things going on. One of them is in the, I know it's a sort of a false split, but, it's a useful one. in the political world, the conversation about education is not really about education. It's about critical race theory and what's in books in libraries and things that are subjects for campaigning and subjects for stumping, for the politicians out on the trail talking about, we need to rein in these teachers, or we need to rein in these professors, or we need to, do this, or look what they're teaching your children. It's all that kind of stuff, and it's sort of political and culturally oriented, and it's designed, as it is appropriate, I guess, in a political campaign to stir voters and to get them to look at issues that a particular politician is working on and has some advantage, or feels that he or she has some advantage over an opponent. But if you look at schools and you say, what's really going on in schools, what should we be talking about, or what else might we be talking about if we weren't in campaigns? You've got this giant, the sort of the glaring problem is this giant learning gap that occurred during the pandemic when we sent all the kids home for a bit, depending on the school district, 2 or 3 or sometimes even 4 semesters. And the kids are falling behind, and it's really evident in the test scores. If you look at, how the test scores were going in 2019 and how they're going now, the kids have fallen off. This pandemic streak of virtual learning left a real mark on these kids. And if you think about, you can't look at education and say, it's working most of the time. It didn't work for this contingent of children. And this cohort, you need to catch them up. You need to do some things to bring them to the levels they would have been had they been in class. And you need to do it while they're still in school. So you need to act pretty quickly. Teachers are jumping up and down about this. Superintendents are jumping up and down about this. It's not a particularly spicy political issue, but it's a real issue and one of the main things that government does. So that was how I did that split. I looked at it and said, what else might they be looking at? And I didn't get to other things like, we've got a teacher shortage problem going on that's, I think, going to be evident this summer when we find out how many teachers are really dissatisfied enough to quit and how many people are coming into the profession. And then we figure out, how do we open the schools for 5.5 million kids without all the teachers that we supposedly need?
It's interesting how as you lay that out. I mean, in some ways, and we get to play the old guys now. I mean, the focus on content is not new. That is the focus on curriculum, and it's not new from both sides. This has been kind of a front line periodically in education. Thinking back. You may remember where to locate this in time a little better than I do, but it seems to me somewhere between 8 and 12 years ago, there was a lot of action at the State Board of Education on the content of textbooks that, had a lot of, sort of the cultural overtones and the cultural politics that you're talking about right now.
Right. Part of the fight then was Confederates and, how do we present the Civil War and how do we teach that history? Now it's much more about race and how do we present that history, if we present that history at all. And it's become, it's to some extent, I guess it was then, but now it is certainly a national issue as much as it is a state issue. This conversation is not bound by the Texas border.
Yeah, and now it's it's got the extra element of gender and sexual identity that have been plugged into this. I want to move on from education in a minute, but I mean it seems to me, and I think this is kind of implied in what you're saying, but if we put this into the trajectory of education politics over the last 2 to 3 legislative sessions, and I wonder if you agree with this. I mean, it feels to me like what this is pointing to is something of a missed opportunity, because as we go into the next legislative session, unless things really shift dramatically, the state is going to be awash in money, between federal money and this comes up in the broadband column that you did, that much of the broadband money is going to be sourced federally, but we don't know the specifics. But in terms of education, the state is going to be awash in money. We took some initial steps that in the 2019 session to put some more money into public education and to start thinking about tinkering with the formulas. This is, of course, linked to property taxes. But it looks to me that, we're headed towards a missed opportunity as a result of the current focus that you're talking about and the pivot to these sort of more, what you're thinking of as more campaign-oriented issues. I guess what I'm wondering is it going to be a little more deeply rooted than that by the time we get to the session?
Well, I think, every election determines what the next legislature is going to do. You can tell in January and February of a legislative year, which is every 2 years, what happened in the elections in November, a couple of months before. And people campaign on all of these things, and then they go to Austin or they go to Washington, and they feel like they need to fulfill their promises, and they feel like they need to mend whatever, slights voters found in them. A great example of this was the Republicans in Texas got something of a rebuke in the 2018 elections. They didn't lose. They lost some seats in the legislature. They didn't lose any statewide seats, but a lot of those races were close in ways they hadn't been close in ages. And everybody kind of got a wake-up call there, and they came into the 2019 legislative session. The 2017 legislative session was a big fight, among other things, about the so-called bathroom bill, which was, where transgender people use, which restroom transgender people are allowed to use in public buildings. And it was a big, nasty culture war fight. They came back somewhat admonished in the 2018 election, and in 2019 said, okay, we're not going to do anything but meat and potatoes stuff. And as you said a minute ago, they worked on school finance. They tried to change the formula so that it's harder for property taxes to go up as fast as they have been. They didn't actually cut taxes or get tax relief, but tax rates are going down, appraisals are going up, taxes are going up, but they took a swing at it. Now they're coming in and they've got, according to Glenn Hager, the state controller, $12 to $13 billion in the state's rainy day fund, the economic stabilization fund. It's a kind of savings account, and another $12 or $13 billion that's going to be in surplus. And that's his estimate now, and it keeps getting bigger. And like you say, they're going to walk into the next session with something like $25 billion extra dollars. What are they going to do with it? Are they going to do some kind of a moonshot for education? Are they going to do some kind of a moonshot at property taxes? They've got a lot of money, and they haven't really sort of said what they want to do with it yet. They've got a lot of possibilities that they don't ordinarily have.
Well, and as you say, I mean, the tone of the campaign and the outcome of the election has a way of shaping that, and so we'll have to see. Now, I'm going to use you mentioning the comptroller Glenn Hager is a good transition to broadband. Broadband feels to me a little bit more like your traditional infrastructure issue in Texas, and not one quite as fraught as education, but a little more like, say, transportation and water, in that, there are a lot of stakeholders in these kind of old school infrastructure, call it non-social infrastructure issues. And they percolate and take a long time to get all the stakeholders together to make a move. And it seems like we're in that area with broadband. Does that sound right to you? I mean, we had a big bill last time. Yeah. We've got the federal bill. You wrote about this in the column. And it seems like that is getting closer and a little less fraught.
Getting closer. If you this, if you went to a legislator in Texas 3 sessions ago, which would have been 6 years ago, and said, hey, what do you think about expanding broadband, making it available to more people and making it affordable to people who might have it at the curb and can't afford to get it into the house? They would have said, why is the state paying for people to get Netflix? The pandemic came along and made it very clear that, one of the arguments that had been made was really serious, which is, this isn't about Netflix. This is about telemedicine. It's about education. It's about work. It's about how we live now. And if you don't have broadband access, high-speed broadband access, you're not going to be able to participate in all of the things that you should be able to participate in as a Texan. It's now infrastructure and not moved kind of from luxury to necessity. And they bought that. I mean, during the pandemic, that convinced, virtually everybody in the legislature. And you're right, it's not as much a political event as it is, there are politics in it, but it's more vendor politics and provider politics than it is, politics about whether or not we should do broadband.
Yeah,
The money is the thing here. It's really expensive. And the federal infrastructure bill has a bunch of money. I think it's $42.5 billion nationally for broadband. And they've told the states, you need to map house by house, property by property, where you do and don't have broadband, and then send that in. And based on those maps, the FCC and others will allocate this $42.5 billion. So the wild guess right now is Texas will get between $1 and $4 billion out of the federal thing to expand access to broadband where it's not available now, and to expand or to make it more affordable, subsidize it to some extent in places where people have access to it, but it's beyond their means. And they're working on it. It's actually one of those places where you can look at government and say government's doing here what it's supposed to be doing. They're concentrating on it. They're getting to work on it. The problem is that it's a very slow process, and a lot of that's kind of built into your question. It's a lot of vendors. It's a lot of differing technologies. It's a lot of money.
Yeah, there's a lot of big corporate players involved in this. I mean, although in terms of the counting votes part of this, it's occurring to me there is something about this that's a little bit like education in that, there are ways you can align this because of where the underserved populations are. There's potential here for building rural-urban coalitions that I think is always helpful in the legislature, given the way things are organized. That kind of points us towards redistricting, but I want to ask you one more political thing about the broadband piece. Your column has something that I find it's almost like a little bit of an Easter egg that depends on your engagement with this and how you watch the politics. I find the centrality of the comptroller's office to this very interesting, not only in policy but certainly in political terms. Am I overreading that?
I don't think so. The legislature put it over there, I think, to get it a little bit out of legislative reach. And also, we just had this big mess with electricity and the PUC and public utility regulators in Texas in February of 2021, and they're still working that out on the electric generation side. And in another world, you might hand all of these issues to the Public Utility Commission, and you might hand it to those regulators.
Yeah, not really the time for that.
They said, exactly. You guys worry about electricity, and we'll let somebody else worry about this. The other thing is that it is a pile of money, and the controller is also the state treasurer, and that's a reasonable place to send the federal money and have them write the checks. It's interesting, if you do these projects, you don't distribute the money necessarily to the locals. You distribute it, locally and to vendors and things, and sometimes it'll go through cities and sometimes through counties. But it all starts at the state, and they decided to put it in the controller's office instead of in where telephones have traditionally been regulated, or in the governor's office where other states are doing the infrastructure spending and things like that straight through their governor's office.
And in fact, the governor had, in the midst of the process of producing the legislation that we've seen and the discussion, the governor had appointed a broadband commission, and when the dust cleared, I find it very interesting that the authority, or a lot of latitude, shall we say, wound up in the comptroller's office. I don't want to be gauche, but I do want to be gauche.
Why not? Yeah.
I don't know why I'm acting this way with you, of all people. To be gauche. The comptroller is one of the 800-pound gorillas waiting in the wings in terms of the next era of political change in the state, in electoral politics statewide, is he not?
He is. I think he's, controllers are always positioned. It's one of those offices that's positioned to move up. There's two state offices that are involved basically in everything. One of them is the controller, because that's where all the money goes through. And, all the state employees are paid out of there. All the money comes into the treasury. It's where taxes are collected. They're in every kind of deal, and the people that work over there are aware pretty much of everything going on in government. The other place that's kind of like that is the Attorney General's office, because that's where all the rules and regulations and lawsuits and all of that kind of stuff goes through. So they're really in the loop. And over time, controllers and attorneys general in Texas have been, those are two of the seed beds that's where governors come from, and that's where lieutenant governors come from. sometimes senators and things like that. Glenn Hager's positioned really well right now. The conservatives in the party like him. The moderates in the party like him. The Democrats don't hate him. He's been running a pretty, nice, I guess if you're looking at the future and you're saying, who's going to be potentially on the ballot in 2024 or 26 or 28, Hager's kind of at the top of your list. He's one of those names. Greg Abbott's already at the top. Dan Patrick's the lieutenant governor, probably aging out pretty soon. The attorney general is in legal trouble. Hager's kind of a guy to watch.
Okay, redistricting. And I think in terms of, as we move a little into the political realm now, this is in many ways the parent of all, structural, institutional, quote unquote, problems in the state. Certainly, not the first time we've talked about it, publicly or privately, or the first time you've written about it. You do a really helpful column. I think there's a lot of public service in that column in terms of sorting out, a take on how many competitive seats there are, et cetera, et cetera. But I'll let people read that in the column itself, and we're going to run out of time. So I do want to say, it's perpetually an argument that redistricting has a negative effect on the responsiveness on the system, on party competition, et cetera. Right. I don't think we need to rehash all of that per se. But I do want to ask you, in terms of historical perspective, is there something this time that's worse than before or not? Or is it just business as usual? In other words, how do we place this redistricting, the results of this redistricting round in historical context, and how does it help us explain where we are at this moment in the state?
This was my fourth redistricting. And so every 10 years you see this. And actually, I'm old enough to have seen the Democrats do it. And guess what? They're just as bad. The people in power draw seats for the people in power, and they've gotten more and more efficient at it. And the law has changed mostly through Supreme Court interpretations that make it easier to draw maps that have districts that are solidified, institutionalized party control. So in this Texas map, they've drawn, a number of seats for Republicans. I think it's 84 and 66 for Democrats. And with very few exceptions, the seats drawn for one party or the other are not contestable by the other party. And they've gotten really, really refined at this. 10 years ago, and certainly 20 years ago, you would look at a map and you would say, well, this map, has 150 House seats on it, and 120 of them are predetermined. And isn't that outrageous that only 30 of these seats are competitive in November? Because you'd have about 30 seats where, given the winds of the day and the issues and the personalities on the ballot, 30 seats could go to the Republicans or to the Democrats. Now you're down to 5 in the House. So I guess the real difference is that, even the appearance of some choice is largely gone. And the other thing that's going on is Texas, because of the way the primaries work here, the primaries are way before the general election. Ours are super early. They're in March. And the people that are picking which Republican and which Democrat to send to November are the most Republican Republicans and the most Democratic Democrats. They're the fire-breathing partisans. And so we get a turnout of 17.5% last month of all registered voters showed up to vote. And those people picked candidates that, because of the way the maps are drawn, are basically going into office. They'll finish it next month with the runoffs. But again, that's a party crew, and it's the very partisan people, and the turnout's probably, if history's a guide, going to be even lower. So this has the effect over time of, more and more people don't participate in the part of the election where the candidates are actually chosen, and it gives the politicians drawing the maps much greater control of who is going to get into the state legislature and into the state's congressional delegation.
Yeah, I mean, there's an odd paradox at work here, I think, and I could be wrong about this, but it's interesting that the party, the Republican Party was clearly in control of redistricting this time. No surprise there. But in making a less ambitious play this time than they did in 2010 when they drew those maps. And ultimately protecting more Democrats. It's almost as if the response to the political system being somewhat more competitive, and not as competitive as a lot of, frankly, Democrats say it is, but certainly more competitive, actually has worked to mute the Democratic opposition, through incumbent protection. And that, and I think we're going to see that we're seeing that play out in the numbers that you're talking about.
I think what the Republicans saw in the mid-decade redistricting in the first decade of the century and in the 2010 redistricting is that the maps they were drawing overreached a little bit and in fact decayed over a decade. So you draw a map in 2010 and over the 5 election cycles until the next census, they would do a little bit worse each time. And they drew the maps this time. We'll see how it goes, but they drew these maps, fairly openly, saying we're trying to draw persistent maps that won't erode. And maybe we won't start the decade with a supermajority, but we won't end the decade chewing our fingernails like we did last time. Right.
Well, I'm hoping to have Chairman Hunter on and to talk to him about that. I've had some offline conversations with him that were, and not to give anything up, they weren't in confidence and he didn't say anything out of line, but I think he had a really striking experience with redistricting in the last session. Now, I want to close out, Ross. We've talked. I'm going to keep my promise not to make this a send-off in the face of your impending retirement and departure from the Tribune. But you set me up, though. I would feel remiss. I have to ask you then to step back and ask about your perspective as we talk about all of these fundamental issues. And again, you set me up by just saying this is your 4th redistricting. It'd be malpractice for me to not do something like this. You're obviously taking kind of a, court vision view of where we are. And we've talked a lot, in working on polling about the rising wrong track judgments about the path the state is on, about the increasingly sour mood of Texans. And some of that obviously has some more recent correlates given what the last couple of years have looked like. But I'm still, I want to ask you the right track, wrong track question. You've been looking at the fundamentals, as you step back from this a little bit, do you see this as a short-term fluctuation or do you think something more fundamental is going on here? And what's your sense of the prospects?
I think, I would say generally wrong track. And I would say, oftentimes the people in politics, this is across parties, and I just think that people that get elected are often more focused right now on the political issues that move those small groups of voters in primaries than they are on the real sort of outlook and position and needs of the state. And that if you stand back and say, what are our biggest problems and what are we doing about them? If you walk into work, as a governor and say, how does Texas become the best public school system in the country? Instead of, saying whatever it is you're saying on the campaign trail, then you get a different kind of governance. And, whenever I get pessimistic about the way things are going, it's also true that whenever there's a big problem that presents itself, when, there's a really big issue that overwhelms the politics, politicians listen to the public that wants them to fix things. You see it on a national level when you get something like a 9/11, when everybody stops barking at each other and starts working the problem. One of my favorite analogies for this is in the movie Apollo 13, when the astronauts are in space. You've seen this movie. When the astronauts are in space and they get a problem, and for a second there, everybody at NASA is running around like a chicken with their head cut off. And the main guy says, people settle down, work the problem. And legislators tend to do that when there's a big urgent need and voters are looking to them for leadership. They're not very good at it sort of on their own. And we're at one of those periods where the voters aren't particularly paying attention. 82.5% of us didn't vote in the primaries. And the people who are paying attention aren't talking about the big stuff. So the politicians aren't talking about the big stuff. And we have some big problems that really need to be solved. And that was really the impetus for this series of columns here at the end of my ride. I started with one about Fred Rogers and about Apollo 13 back in early March, and have just been writing about these problems. And that's really the design of it, and that's kind of how I feel about it.
I'm going to think of that as I'm trying to, I'm not going to characterize that position, but I'm going to think about it, and I'll get back to you on how I should characterize that. I was going to say guardedly optimistic, but I'm not sure I'm not sure that's quite right either. But I like the way you laid that out. Ross Ramsey, thanks for being here today and all the times that you've been here before. And I hope, after you take a well-deserved post-retirement hiatus, if you're in a direction to come back, we can have you back. And if not, then I'll drill you over beers.
Sounds fair to me. Thanks for having me.
All right. Thanks again to Ross Ramsey. Thanks to our excellent production team in the audio studio, in the Liberal Arts Development Studio at UT Austin. Thanks for listening. And remember, you can find lots more data, writing, material on Texas politics at the Texas Politics Project website, www.texaspolitics.utexas.edu. I'm Jim Henson, and we'll be back soon with another Second Reading podcast. Thanks for listening. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.